Okay, welcome everybody. I'll start out with some solar news, the news of the week, and then if anybody's got anything to raise, then the topic I had picked for today was talk a little bit about tracking systems, solar trackers. Haven't really covered that before, so I thought I'd touch base on it. All right, so in April of 2022, wind and solar actually generated 20% of the electricity used in the United States that month, which is a record. Wind was about 14%, solar was 6%, and that's about double what it was just in 2016, where wind and solar combined in April of that month in 2016 to generate 9%. And when we add hydro to that mix, hydro generally produces about 6.5% now of the electricity used in the US. So all combined, we're a little over 25%, which is quite an improvement. I always find it interesting, of course, hydro was the very first electric generating process in North America. And in the 1940s, it accounted for about a third of all of the power used in the country. So, but the hydro hasn't changed, just the amount of power that, it consists of has changed. Many of the same sites that were operating in the 1940s are still operating. It's just they're a lesser percentage. Missouri just passed a homeowners association bill that essentially stops homeowners associations from precluding you from installing unreasonably solar on your home in that state. They joined 26 other states that have similar legislation. Ohio has a bill that has passed the Senate, but has not passed the House yet, which would do something similar. I was surprised the Senate, in the Ohio Senate, it passed 31-1. So the opposition is not there. It's a bipartisan bill. So we should see it enacted into law here fairly soon. The Missouri law also exempted solar products from sales tax. So that's another incentive out there. The Department of Energy is offering some money and a program to encourage agrivoltaics. And agrivoltaics is when you combine the raising of crops, grazing of animals, the promotion of pollinators in with solar arrays. I always love the acronyms they come up with. This particular program they called Foundational Agrivoltaics Research for Megawatt Scale, otherwise known as FARMS. Okay, somebody spent a long time on that. So anyway, that's not as bad as some of them. There's a new solar recycling company that is making, or at least sending out press releases. Sunrun is the name of the company. They're claiming that their process will recapture 95% of the materials in a traditional solar panel, which primarily includes silicon, silver, copper, and aluminum. So those would be the recaptured materials there. This one, I guess in the news of the ironic, Silfab, which is a Canadian solar panel manufacturing company, had announced plans to build the very first solar cell manufacturing facility in the United States. They didn't say where, they just said southeastern United States, so I'm not quite sure where that is. Although they've had to put that on hold because the Department of Commerce is investigating Chinese monopolies of polysilicon and cells and modules, and the whole controversy where they moved their production to Southeast Asia, to Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, to get around the tariffs. Well, apparently this investigation has halted the import of polysilicon, which has then put on hold plans to produce solar cells in the United States. So investigating China for a monopoly of silicon has resulted in China having a monopoly in silicon. So that's a bit of the ironic. And with all of this anti-China activity that's been going on in recent years. In 2021, Chinese exports of modules grew 60% over 2020. Wafers grew 40% over 2020, and production and exports in China of both products are up sharply in the first quarter of 2022 versus 2021. So whatever they're doing, it ain't working. So I'm not quite sure what the response is, other than I don't want to run for governor. Okay. Next, Energy Technologies has announced a prototype of transparent solar windows, which I thought the interesting thing about this, basically it converts the ultraviolet and the infrared of the light spectrum into power while letting most of the visible light go through. But the trick on this particular product is it is a film that they adhere to existing windows. So you're not having to replace the windows in a commercial building or a skyscraper. You just apply a film to the existing window and it converts the power that way. They didn't talk about how much the power would be generated, what's the watts per square meter or whatever. But I did find another company called Solar Window, which has a similar product, but I think it's a window itself, a replacement window, has efficiencies up to 15%, which is pretty good compared to a traditional solar panel, which is going to be in the range of 22% or so. So that's the news I found, other than a lot of big projects being installed. So anybody have anything to share or any questions that you've got this week?
I think I read in the paper this morning that the federal government is still going to continue with the tax incentives at 22%.
Well, it goes that way for another year. I think if I remember right, it steps down to 22% in 2024, isn't it? It's 26 for 22 and 23. Then it steps down for 24, and then who knows? So you know,
in the paper this morning, they kind of indicated they were going to continue to do that. That's what they were insinuating, anyhow.
Yeah, that get my guess, because then they can deal with it after the election in 2024, rush through something at the last minute and decide to extend it without people, without it being a political issue. Who knows? It typically has bipartisan support when it gets up there for a vote. This investment tax credit has been extended, half a dozen times, I think, over the years. Seems to me the first one came in play around 2008, and they just keep extending it for periods of time, which has its own set of problems, because you cannot really plan for long-term, what are going to be the economics of the program. If you're talking about a utility scale solar system, and it takes 3 years from the beginning to actual implementation, and you're dealing with short-term incentives, and the project has to be complete before these incentives can become locked in, may or may not, you just don't know. You don't know what the go-ahead is on that. So last I saw, they were talking 10-year extension, though.
Yeah. Jay, just so you know, the industrial ones have a different rule for placed in service.
Oh, you mean the utility scale?
Yeah, they can lock it in earlier. Well, corporate ones, yeah. So typically utility scale, they can lock it in by, I think they just have to have X% of the planning done.
Oh, okay.
So if they have the engineering plans and stuff done, I think, I'm not exactly sure what the threshold was, but I know it's much easier than placed in service the same way it is for individuals.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. I mean,
but it's still hard to plan with it. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's always one of the issues in corporate planning is uncertainty. As they always like to say, uncertainty is the devil to investors anyway. They want a certain return. And I know, Don, you do a lot of accounting, and it's always nice to know what the numbers are going to be next year.
Exactly. They do the same thing with the R&D credit. They don't approve it until after the year it's done. So you have to go back retroactively. You don't get the benefit for it. Well, you get the benefit for it, but not in the books when you publish them at the SEC.
Mhm. Okay,
So, but they do that a lot.
yep. Because the alternative would be too easy.
I thought it was a really good article because it pointed out that how much cheaper it is now for individuals to actually put a solar system in their house.
Yeah,
It was a very complimentary. I think they even said like it started at 40, it's now to $20,000 for the average person. And they said it's much cheaper and much easier.
yeah, I know the numbers that are out there when we've talked about some of the surveys still have for small residential systems in the between $2.50 and $3 a watt installed, soup to nuts. So I know some larger systems, when I do some estimation, I throw in about $2 a watt, if it's going to be 50 kW or larger. And some of the installers I've talked to said, man, I'd love to get $2 a watt for a system like that. So that may even be a little bit generous, but it's not going to be below $1.80. Utility scale are looking at, $1 a watt kind of pricing for these, 500 kilowatt or 1 megawatt systems. So the price is way down. At some point in the future, if logic dictates, these investment tax credits are supposed to be an incentive to have you install because of affordability. But if the systems continue to be very, very affordable, then with or without that investment tax credit, if you're making policy, you may look at it and say, why are we still giving a tax break to this activity when it is a mature technology that's affordable? Shouldn't we let market forces dictate? It's a compelling argument, whether you want to buy it. I would say, well, then do it for all sources of fuel, like fossil fuels and coal and wind and all of them. If you just take that attitude of let market forces dictate, that would be fine. But government doesn't seem very good at that, keeping their hands off and not trying to push their thumb on the scale, so to speak. So in this case, let's help them push it on our scale, since we can be as hypocritical as anybody else, right? All right.
Hey, Jay, I have a question.
Sure.
We always talk about this in terms of economics, but in some sense, the whole goal of this is to reduce carbon.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm wondering if anybody, of any research that's been done that compares the carbon that it gets generated as a result of producing the solar panels and the racking as compared to the electricity that they produce.
Yeah, I can't quote it offhand, but I remember doing a little bit of research into that at one point. And it wasn't as bad as I kind of expected it to be. I was kind of expecting it to be like an ethanol kind of thing where, it takes $2 of energy to produce $1 worth of energy using corn in ethanol. But it turned out it was relatively light. Certainly light compared to the cost of building a coal power plant or a natural gas power plant. The inputs there are pretty substantial compared, and they have a period of time before they're recovered. And that was kind of the thrust of the article, saying, okay, let's say it takes you 2.5 years to recover the energy inputs from the energy outputs of a facility. And solar compared pretty favorably to all of those, but it's not, without its environmental consequences. I think that's something we have to acknowledge.
Yeah, Jay, I think the studies that I've read is 50 grams per kilowatt hour. That's about 20 times less impactful from a carbon perspective than coal. 20 times.
Yeah, and of course, Yeah, that's looking at it from an environmental standpoint of how much carbon it emits, looking at it from an economic, an embedded energy cost of the plant. That's another way you can look at it. How much energy did it take? Silicon is a pretty energy intensive process. You've got to basically melt and create glass, in the module. But that's one of the goals with perovskite. And we're looking at that process where you can create solar panels that are equally as efficient as silicon for just a fraction of the embedded energy cost and a fraction of the materials. So I think solar is pretty good right now in that, and it's getting better. Whereas coal and natural gas, they're pretty mature technologies. I don't see them making strides, as far as getting better. Of course, coal is a technology that's on its way out. We see that in all of the numbers. Nobody's building new coal power plants. The only things that use coal basically in the US are electricity generation and the refinement of metals such as steel and aluminum, but they're finding better alternatives there. So, in 20 years, we probably will not be talking about coal as an energy source, the same way we don't really talk much about steam engines as being a source for running your car. It's technology moves on. We still have steam engines for generating electricity, which is bizarre, but that's an industry that hasn't kept up with modern times. Anybody else have any questions or anything to?
Yeah, Jay, this is just a curiosity of mine, and maybe nobody on the call knows this, and maybe it's kind of like a shouting into the darkness or preaching to the choir. But I've been doing a lot of reading and research and thinking on utility company strategy as it relates to solar and other forms of renewable energy generation and storage. What I don't understand is why utility companies, and there are of course exceptions, but generally why utility companies are both evil and stupid. You could probably get away with one or the other, but both is not a great combination. So like I fall into our utility is in the fiefdom of First Energy. And I think they have a total of 6 million folks that fall into that territory. Many utilities are quasi monopolies. So what I'm trying to figure out is why aren't utility companies leveraging their quasi monopoly status to cash in on solar installations in their territory, either directly, like First Energy solar guys up on your roof, or indirectly by cutting a contract, investing in, J Solar, and then giving J Solar essentially an exclusive on 6 million homes in their territory to make a bump from like a valuation perspective. Like why is it seems like the universal strategy is to just fight and entrench and look really bad and then also lose, like we're saying in Florida, versus like cashing out on this opportunity?
They're not designed to be entrepreneurial. They're designed to be. They're not. They're designed to be like a public. Well, they are public utility. I mean, they're just designed to do mediocre stuff, make product, and get cost plus return.
The opposite of entrepreneurial or innovation is public utility. That's kind of like that was that Freudian slip that you just made.
This doesn't mean it's you're yelling into the wind. It makes sense what you're saying, but these guys are not designed to, these are people who are like government. They're like government people. As long as nothing, all they care about is the lights staying on and getting their return. If there's the slightest bit of uncertainty, which they don't know about solar, so that's a little bit of uncertainty.
There was
But they
a
have to deal with
congressman
it,
from
right?
Ohio that called First Energy an ongoing criminal enterprise. So
When you say they have to deal with it, why do they have to deal with it? Because you're going to pay them cost plus as long as they keep getting approved by the utility commission. So why do they have to deal with it? I'm not trying to be
No,
difficult.
yeah, yeah. I mean, like they're actively nationally, they're actively, pushing legislation through bribery or other means to end net metering or do some, do a lot of shady things. What I don't
Bribery is
understand.
such a judgment laden term, they're making donations to the politicians,
Outcome based donations, future looking outcome based donations.
Understood.
Hey, Tony, it's worked for them for 100 years. Why change now? I mean,
Yeah.
I think my only analogy there, I was involved in the telecommunications industry when it went through deregulation. And back in the old days of the Bell telephone system, we used to refer to everybody who worked there as bellheads. And they had this process. And everything, there was the Bell standards and practices, right? Every move that every manager ever made was dictated by the Bell standards and practices. And you could walk into any office and know what the salary of that guy was, depending upon the carpet they had, the ashtray that was on their table, what chair they were allowed to receive. And these guys thought they were geniuses because they made a profit, which was dictated by law and supplied to them. And then when the industry was deregulated, all these bellheads ran off to run internet-based companies. Almost every one of them went bankrupt because they were complete and utter management buffoons. And that's the people who populate the utility industry. They think they're geniuses because the system is rigged to make sure that they cannot lose.
Or they do things like buy cash register companies in Dayton, Ohio, and figure out that they don't know how to run or make computers.
Yeah.
Because they're not exactly like telephones. They're really close, but they were that far apart, and that's why they had to get rid of it after 5 years.
Yeah, so the advantage goes to folks like yourself, because the utility should dominate the solar industry. They should dominate the energy industry, just like, Bell should have dominated the internet, but they will not, because they do not have the corporate mindset or the ability for the rapid turnaround of thought process or empathy or vision or whatever. So they'll all retire to Florida and complain about how they're senior citizens on a fixed income, and that the guy who was their caddy at the golf club was rude to them because he didn't polish their white shoes or whatever.
It's like P&G. Yeah, it's a huge bureaucracy. It's big. Tony, just think of him as a carcass to be picked off of.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to do both the killing and the picking. I just think it's strange, right?
Yeah.
It's like one of those things where you kind of look around because it feels too good to be true, right? It's like, how are these guys missing this? And it's not like some weird hyper specific nerdy niche. Like solar's pretty mainstream.
Yeah.
And to not capitalize off of that seems odd to me, like very odd.
Think of it like evolution. The people who went into First Energy or Duke or any of those places are not entrepreneurs. They're not cutting edge people. Granted, big power plants are sophisticated technological organizations, but it's like, we're going to do this and we're going to keep getting the efficiencies better. We're going to keep getting the, we're going to go from 99.5% to 99.7% effective for this turbine. And that's going to do it. They're not like groundbreaking, we're going to open up the world and, start a whole new revolution. That's just not the kind of people who you put in charge of that, or that raise up to that level, because they're run by the public utility or the Public Utility Commission.
This is called a paradigm shift in organizational language. So, what happens is, when you start doing something, you put on a set of blinders and you get focused in it, and you have to block out all this other stuff in the world around you. And so you live in a certain paradigm, just like you're living in a certain paradigm too. Because, over time, you will become subject to the same thing that they have.
Sure.
And And unless you can break free of that paradigm and develop a whole new thought world and thinking about the world in a completely different way, you'll become a dinosaur too. So that's the people who are really successful over time are people who welcome change, who see change as constant opportunity, which generally most of us don't.
I would just defend them a little bit in this regard. They are a regulated company, and
Right.
many of the things that they would need to do to effectively compete, they're prohibited from doing by regulation. So what happened in the telecom world is, as this process was undergoing, they ended up splitting into the regulated divisions and the deregulated divisions, and operated for a period of time as two separate companies. And I suspect we'll see some of this happening in utilities. At the moment, there's not a serious threat to them as far as their core business as they see it. You know, there isn't an Apple that's come out and say, I will be your utility company in this region where First Energy operates. When that happens, they're going to just totally freak. But at the moment, they're seeing a creeping of technologies, and how can we take this new technology and turn it to our advantage? So you're starting to see a little bit of that happening by them shifting to installing utility scale solar and shutting down some of the coal power plants that are too expensive to operate. And at the same time, trying to prohibit other people from competing against them, which is another part of their strategy. But, you know, that's a little bit way too late, you know, because as we know, because we're on this call, the whole world is changing underfoot, and you can't have incremental changing. As Don said, you can't go from 98 to 98.2. You know, you've got to say, all right, let's blow up the business and start all over again. And yeah, they're not ready to do that.
The interesting like mental model that I have, I mean, because you know, I did about 8 years, a little more than 8 years in the Army, right? And that's a traditionally not super innovative, very bureaucratic, highly regulated, right? So there's, I think, a lot of parallels between the military or the Army and utilities, but like the Army's way of solving this problem is, you know, they stood up special operations to wage war very differently. And they were often considered the, you know, the bastard children of the Department of Defense until like what they started to do was working. So you might have an overly bureaucratic conventional organization, but to have a little piece of inside of that as like your skunk works to kind of say, hey, what's going on? Let's dabble a little bit, I think protects you against that paradigm shift. And I'm just surprised we don't see more utility companies with that model. Like, fine, I get it, you're overly bureaucratic and you're highly regulated, but to not have like any skunk works inside that monolith that can figure out like, hey, let's try to stand up a solar company inside of this and let's test it out, seems very odd to me.
But what's their incentive? I agree with you from a business perspective, but what's their incentive? They are set up to get a cost plus return, and if they do something that's screwed up, they don't get a return on it. And if it does really well, they're not necessarily going to get that much of a benefit from it.
Yeah,
I would return.
I might argue that the problem, like why there are so many turds in the utility companies to begin with, is that many of them are geographically constrained by mandate.
Yep.
So you have a territory, unlike the private sector, which you could theoretically expand indefinitely, you know, nationally, internationally. Yep. That's not the case with utilities. So you have a set fixed of, you know, you have a fixed degree of territory-ish. Yeah, there's, you know,
but like Duke, think of Duke. It's North Carolina, now it's Ohio, now it's Kentucky. But they do that through acquisition typically. You're right. Historically, there's a company that covers an area as the primary.
Right. So in my mind, it's like if you were somewhat geographically constrained, then you can the only way that you can make more money or grow is if you have more people using energy in that geographic area, which is why like they should all be about electric vehicles, because that's a way to take up a hell of a lot more energy in a geographically constrained spot. But they should also be looking at ways to monetize that region, like doing solar installations, or installing energy storage, selling energy storage and installing energy storage,
Mhm.
where they can make more money without having to go national or international.
Everything you say makes perfect sense, but remember, think of it like in oil. There were the wildcatters who went out and figured everything out and did everything and were doing all the wild stuff. Then their kids or the next generation of corporate bureaucracy came in, they consolidated, got bigger.
Sure.
And now the guys at the top are just wanting to collect money. And I don't mean that in a bad way. They're not the entrepreneurs.
Sure.
The entrepreneurs in that industry and the utilities industry have kind of died out. I mean,
Yeah.
Oh, here's the thing, real quick. I work for First Energy as a contractor. We have no generation any longer.
Right.
We're into transmission and distribution.
Distribution. Yes.
Probably real estate. You know?
Right.
So, I mean, we have no hydro. We sold all of our hydro plants. Of course, the coal went away. Even our gas plants we sold. So, whatever the model is on the 31st floor in Akron, I don't know, but whatever.
I think a good analogy would be, back in the late 1800s, railroads were king, and then they were disrupted by the automobile industry. Well,
Correct.
why didn't Chesapeake and Ohio dominate the automobile industry? What was their reaction? And what they did actually in England, they passed what was referred to as the Red Flag Act, where they required that a person walk in front of a car waving a red flag and a person walk behind the car waving
I
a
thought it was a red
flag.
light.
No, it's a red flag.
Flag?
And because cars were so dangerous and railroads were safe, and it didn't work, obviously, and whatever these guys are doing isn't going to work, obviously. I mean, to you, to me, to Don, to all of us here, it's so clear that the utility industry as a whole, at least for the long term, has to transition and has to change. They're not going to. So the new innovations will be the Steve Jobses of the world working in their garages and coming up with the next big thing. And that's exciting. That's good. I don't think I want First Energy dominating for the next several decades. I would just as soon some other evil person like Bill Gates come around and give them a chance for a while. Then we can
Who might
hate
be
them.
evil and smart instead of evil and stupid, huh?
Right.
Well, they tend to be that. The first generation tends to be smart and ruthless,
Yeah.
And so we'll put you in there, Tony, as the smart and ruthless generation.
I'll be the pirate all day long.
That's
Go
right.
after His Majesty's Royal Navy. They're
No,
big
we'll
and
call
slow,
you
man.
we'll call you a privateer because we'll give
That's
you
right.
edicts from the
That's right.
government to rob us.
Perfect.
Right. So, okay.
One thing
Anybody
I've learned
else
about-
have anything else to raise there? Chris?
One thing I've learned about government and everything else is if you want common sense and logic, you went to the wrong spot.
Yeah. Well, those
It's
of
just
us
not
who
gonna happen.
have worked in bureaucracies, the thing I always like to think about is in a bureaucracy, typically every single rule, every single thing makes perfect sense. But when you put it all together, it's absurd, I mean, none of it makes any sense. So, and I think you're going to get a lot of that in government, in utilities, and any large business. So trick is
Well,
to stay
and the other
small.
part of it is, it's one thing that this country is really bad at, is nobody looks long-term. A big business, I mean, most of the European companies like Mercedes, for example, they plan 20 years down the road. So they're looking at the new technology, how they're going to enhance it and do all that kind of stuff. United States, we look 2 years down the road. And if you get really lucky, you might find somebody 5 years down the road.
Or
Typically,
2
it's
months.
They're not-
two quarters down the road.
Yeah.
If it's
Yeah.
2 years down the road, you'll be gone by that time.
Yeah.
If you don't do good.
So
2
that's
quarters.
why they don't want to embrace the new technology, because they haven't planned that far out.
Uh-huh. Well, it makes it exciting for the rest of us.
But on the other hand, the Europeans don't have what you'd call normal if capitalism is kind of akin to democracy, the Europeans have interlinking boards so that each of the big companies are on the boards of the other companies. So they're quite cozy people over there. There's not, there's goods and bads with each side. No, they are looking much further forward, but they're also kind of cushy and nothing's going to happen, and no bad shareholder is going to come up and say, hey, we think you're not doing a good job.
Yeah, then there's the
Or if they do, they don't.
Japanese that have a 300-year plan.
Yeah. It's not working out with them in the last 30 too well, but they
Oh,
still
give
have
it-
270 more years to go. I do know. Yes.
Yeah, give it a couple generations. So, all
Yeah.
right. Okay, anything else here before I jump a little bit into tracking systems? So I know this is good. I appreciate that, Tony, because that's fun to diss utilities, especially First Energy periodically. It's sort of like gets the blood going, and it's good. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about tracking systems, only because I was doing some of the work on the level 2 book, and I was kind of curious to find that, of course, tracking systems primarily are being used in utility scale systems, utility scale units, and they're often being used to maximize production and minimize space. If you look about how these things are marketed, if you look at a typical list of advantages and disadvantages, the advantages of tracking, they'll produce 10 to 25% more power for the same amount of space. They do cost a little bit more, but they can track and orient for time of use production in more efficiently if you're dealing with that. And that advances in the technology have resulted in lower maintenance costs. So that's the pro cost. The anti is they cost more money. That's an issue. Now, at the utility scale, they'll say that they cost 8 cents to 10 cents per watt more, which is significant if you're talking $1 a watt or less for a utility scale system. So adding another 10% is significant. But if it's going to produce 20% more power, that's a good return on your investment. For smaller scale systems, though, when I was looking, it typically is going to add significantly to the cost. So if you have a small 4 kW system, for example, and it costs you, let's say, $12,000, you're paying $3 a watt for the install, and then you spend another $8,000 to put a tracking system on it. Well, now you're talking about an increase in cost of, another 60% or so on top of the cost that you already had. And if this thing only produces 25% more energy, it's not going to be a good return on your investment for smaller systems. So as a result, logically, we don't see a lot of smaller tracking systems except in unusual circumstances. It might be that a corporate park wants something that looks pretty and puts the little solar flowers in there, or it might be that the place you're going to site it is so small, you need a dual axis tracking system. But then as I was looking at it, at the utility scale system, what they talk about is power density and ground cover ratios. And essentially ground cover ratios is how much of the available space for the array is actually covered with solar panels. So a ground cover ratio of 1 would be 100%, like a flat roof. The whole space that's available to the array has solar panels in it. But if you have like a ballasted system, even fixed where the panels are at an angle, you can't have them shading each other. So you have to move the second row back. And at that point, you might have a ground cover ratio of 60%, 50%, whatever. If you push them tighter together, the ground cover ratio goes up. Further apart, the ground ratio goes down. So what they were talking about is with fixed utility scale, the ground cover ratio for a fixed solar panel is greater than the ground cover ratio for a tracking system. which at first bent doesn't make sense. Why do you have to push the rows further apart when you've got tracking than when you've got a fixed array? And at that point, it begins to make sense if you talk about, most of our panels, I'll use my hand here as a demonstration. I have videos, but I don't want to jump back and forth there. It'll be a little bit distracting. So let's say you've got rows of solar panels and they begin the day lying flat, because typically they'll go ahead and lie flat overnight to deal with wind issues and things like that. And then they're oriented to the east and west. So over here, if this is the sun, this is east in the morning. And as the day progresses, they'll go like that. So at noon, at solar noon, it'll be directly flat. And then it'll continue, although my arm doesn't bend that way, all the way. So west, it'll be, if you think about it, logically, it would be a vertical 90 degrees at dawn and at dusk. Problem is you've got multiple rows. So if you're going vertical, then this row here is going to shade all of the subsequent rows. So if they were vertical at dawn, only the very first row of panels would receive any sunlight. So they institute what's referred to as backtracking. And sometimes, like if you look at the PV Watts system, you'll see when it's asking you to select which type of panel, it will say single axis, dual axis, or backtracking. And that's another option. So the backtracking, what it does is it calculates and says, okay, at dawn, I should be vertical. But if I am at vertical, I'm going to be shading all the subsequent panels. So I'm going to put the orientation at a different angle. And I'm going to then allow to try and minimize inter-row shading. So what ends up happening with your tracking system is you're not at an ideal angle with the sun. And that takes place probably for about 25% of the day. In the early morning and in the late afternoon, all of your panels are at angles that are not ideally suited for the angle of the sun. And of course, because you're going more vertical than you would with a fixed system, you have to spread them apart. So there it becomes a question of how much return are you getting by putting a tracking system in versus what you would get if you didn't put the tracking system in. And it appears when you incorporate backtracking, and another significant cost with utility is the cost of land. So if you have to spread these panels out further in order to accommodate a tracking system, then you're going to have more land for a similar size array. So that becomes an issue. Then typically tracking systems traditionally have only worked well on level property, things that have a grade of less than 10%. So now you're saying, okay, there's going to be more site work if I can level it out, or I'm going to limit my options on where I can site these arrays. So tracking systems then are not quite as flexible as fixed mounting systems. And the one that I wanted to do a little research, which I did, of course, is on maintenance costs. And I did find it interesting that the maintenance costs on a tracking system don't appear to be as much as compared to fixed systems. The difference doesn't appear to be as much as I would have guessed. Let me share this and see if you guys have a similar perspective. But this is a study. It's the most recent numbers I could find for operation and maintenance costs on solar arrays. And I found it kind of interesting. This was put together by NREL, and they're saying that per kilowatt hour per year, the costs are for a residential system, they're assuming vegetation and module cleaning at about 80 cents per kilowatt hour, where when you get up into commercial and utility and tracking, it's more around $3 a kilowatt. Inspection and monitoring, the costs are here, commercial being the highest. Component replacement, things wearing out, They didn't really go into detail as to what keeps wearing out on residential systems. I find that might be a little extreme.
Do they have
Module
repairs, Jay?
repairs, maintenance,
Yeah, I'm thinking most of the tilted or moving arrays I see, the motor dies at one point and they never get fixed.
yeah, but these are for residential systems in total.
Right, for that one in total. I'm thinking on the other side, when you're comparing to the moving systems.
Yeah, the
I-
tracking has about 87 cents, which makes sense. In fact, I would have guessed it's higher because you do have motors, you do have things of that nature that will break. But I know I've had my array for, gosh, since 2014, so 8 years. I haven't had to replace anything except one microinverter.
But I guess you're not tracking though.
No, I
I'm
know,
thinking
but
yeah.
these are not tracking either
Yeah,
necessarily.
the 455 doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not sure what you'd be replacing
Yeah,
at that level.
unless you've got teenage kids, who break everything, who knows? But yeah, I can see these numbers over here. Yeah, there are gonna be some things that break. Module replacements, that's gonna happen relatively infrequently, but when you're talking about this is the price per kilowatt, I could see a small fraction, 1 in 100 panels, having something happen where you've got to replace it. Inverter replacement, again, I can see that, although that number's coming down because inverter warranties are getting longer. So the costs are going to be less. And then operations administration. Not quite sure that any residential customer is going to monitor it to that extent. But
Okay. For a system about 150, 200 kilowatt size. And I know you're looking at the figures here, but in terms of frequency for such a system, in terms of operation and maintenance, do they have a ballpark figure? What is a recommended frequency of use? So it's something you just go based upon the location.
okay, I didn't quite catch the question. Was there a question there? Or-
Yeah, the question is this, David. I just put it together a system size about 150 to say 200 kilowatt in size, right?
Uh-huh.
So what the question I'm asking with respect to the costing for operation maintenance, is there a frequency in terms of how frequent systems should be maintained, carried out? Because if you're saying like 80 cents, US cents per kilowatt hour, and you saying that, well, let's see, but it does seem that you do a maintenance schedule, let's say 3 times a year or 4 times a year. That's pretty expensive. So
Yeah.
what I was trying to get is there like a standard schedule, so to speak, in terms of how frequent operational maintenance should be?
Yeah, maybe somebody has more frequent numbers, but I know when I was doing research before, it recommended, but this of course was for residential, checking connections about once a year, just doing kind of a walkthrough on an annualized basis to make sure things hadn't loosened up. With utility scale, it may or may not be more frequent than that, because I think there is usually requirements if you're going to deal with it as an investment scale thing where you've got to check the circuits at least annually, maybe check them every 6 months. Often now people are using drones to do flyovers, which reduce the operation and maintenance costs quite a lot. You can install a thermal imaging camera on the drone and see if there are any hot spots on the panels, see if there are any, certainly arcing would be a severe situation, but mostly you're looking for vegetation issues, panel issues if there's a hot spot with the thermal imaging camera. But I would say at least once a year, do a physical check. For me, snow removal in the winter is sort of an ongoing maintenance thing that if you gotta clear that off. Although I must admit this last winter, I didn't seem to care as much as I have in previous winters. But Does anybody else have any better information than that on routine maintenance requirements on commercial systems or larger? Buddy? All right, I'll look into some of that because I've got to do, as I said, I'm updating the level 2, the advanced book, and I want to really expand the maintenance and
Yeah.
testing and troubleshooting chapters there. One thing that I'm finding quite interestingly is as I'm doing a lot of research on the commercial level, there doesn't seem to be a lot of good reference material out there for these larger systems. There's
Yeah,
a-
I myself have fun because I'm doing 2 projects out of St. Vincent. One is a 50 kilowatt peak and the other one is a 150 kilowatt peak, but I have to do a levelized cost proposal for the plant on the system. So I was trying to estimate what the annual maintenance cost over and then do it over a 20-year period at the life cycle of the system to give an idea what the actual cost of the system would be over that period of time. But it's very difficult to find information and trying to say, look, should I do maintenance 3 times a year or every 2 times a year? Because there's
Yeah.
another factor here. It's really a challenge to try and work it out sometimes.
Well, that NREL report that I just cited there does say that for commercial systems, you should anticipate just under $10 per kilowatt per year for operation
Wow.
and maintenance costs. But that is data based on 2018. They didn't
18.
have any newer data. But some of it depends because there are costs associated with not only maintaining the plant, but also monitoring the plant. So if you subcontract with some sort of monitoring service, there are going to be ongoing costs associated with that. You know, if you subcontract with a lawn service company, there are going to be costs there. So some of it is how much do you do yourself and how much do you contract out? And, you know, well, if you're doing good accounting, you should allocate the costs to yourself as well. But most companies don't do that. If they've already got a lawn care guy and he's going to take care of the array at the same time he takes care of the rest of the grounds, you're not going to throw that in as an additional cost caused by the array, even though it might need to be allocated that way. So what is down there in Trinidad? What is your installation cost on a 150 kW array? What's the install cost when it's all over?
Well, the project is not in Trinidad. This is actually in St. Vincent.
Okay.
And I was budgeting about 300,000 US for both the 150 and the 50. The 50 about 85,000 US and the rest for the 150.
So about $2 a watt US?
Yeah, I only say so.
Okay. All right. That seems about comparable. Little high. You must not have a lot of competition down there. So
Yes, it does.
uh-huh. Okay, so does anybody have any questions on the tracking systems a little bit? I think my takeaway on it is for smaller systems, tracking doesn't make any sense and it's making less sense all the time. Where for the utility scale systems, it is kind of the norm at the moment, but I think as the cost of the modules and the racking gets less, and the cost of the available land and the cost of human beings maintaining the system continues to increase, we'll probably see less and less tracking, even at the larger systems. I think fixed arrays just make a little bit more sense in today's economy. All right, anything to add to the good of the cause? We're approaching our hour. Nope. All right. Well, I'll see you guys next week. We'll call it a day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay.